The Berlin Wall. For decades, it stood as the defining symbol of the Cold War, a physical and ideological barrier separating East and West. Built seemingly overnight in 1961, the wall became a stark representation of division, oppression, and political tension between two superpowers locked in a global struggle. For nearly 3 decades, it defined the world order. But on the night of November 9, 1989, something extraordinary happened. The wall fell. The world watched in shock as East Germans streamed through checkpoints, embraced their fellow citizens, and celebrated an event that few had imagined possible. But what was the real reason the Berlin Wall fell? Was it an inevitable collapse, or was it the result of strategic decisions, political pressure, and the courage of ordinary people who dared to defy an oppressive regime? To understand why the wall fell, we must first understand why it was built. After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 zones controlled by the Allied powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. While the Western zones merged into the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, the Soviet-controlled sector, became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. Berlin, although located deep within Soviet-controlled territory, was also divided. The western half of the city, controlled by the Allies, became a beacon of freedom and prosperity, a stark contrast to the authoritarian rule of East Germany. By the late 1950s, East Germany was in crisis. Hundreds of thousands of East Germans, disillusioned by economic hardships and political repression, were fleeing to the West. Every day, thousands used Berlin as their escape route, crossing freely into West Berlin before heading to West Germany. The East German government, under Soviet pressure, saw this mass exodus as an existential threat. On August 13, 1961, they took drastic action. Barbed wire was rolled out overnight, followed by concrete walls and armed guards. The Berlin Wall had been born. Families were torn apart, escape attempts were met with deadly force, and the wall became the most infamous physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain. For nearly 3 decades, the wall stood firm. East Germans lived under strict surveillance, prevented from traveling freely, and forced to accept the control of the Communist Party. Escape attempts were met with brutal consequences. More than 140 people died trying to cross the wall. Meanwhile, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated, with Berlin remaining a flashpoint of conflict. American presidents, from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan, used Berlin as a stage for symbolic messages, denouncing the wall as a prison and calling for its removal. And yet, for years, nothing changed. So what shifted? How did this seemingly permanent structure crumble in a single night? The answer lies in a combination of economic decline, political reform, and the unstoppable will of the people. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was weakening. Years of economic stagnation, an arms race with the West, and military interventions, particularly in Afghanistan, had drained Soviet resources. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he introduced 2 key policies: glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring. Glasnost encouraged greater freedom of speech and political discussion, while perestroika aimed to revitalize the failing Soviet economy. But these reforms had unintended consequences. Instead of stabilizing the Eastern Bloc, they emboldened citizens to push for even greater freedoms. Throughout Eastern Europe, a wave of protests and movements for change erupted. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Wałęsa, had gained traction throughout the 1980s, demanding democratic reforms. In Hungary, the government began dismantling its border fences with Austria, creating an escape route for East Germans. By the summer of 1989, thousands of East Germans were fleeing through Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and even into West German embassies in Eastern Europe, forcing East German authorities into a crisis. Meanwhile, within East Germany itself, resistance was growing. Weekly protests known as the Monday demonstrations gained momentum, drawing tens of thousands of citizens demanding democratic reforms. Leipzig became the epicenter of this movement, with increasing numbers taking to the streets each week. By October 1989, demonstrations had swelled to over 300,000 people. The East German government, led by Erich Honecker, faced an unprecedented challenge. Honecker had long resisted reform, but growing pressure from both the people and the Soviet Union forced his resignation on October 18, 1989. His successor, Egon Krenz, attempted to introduce limited reforms, but it was too late. The people wanted more than just small concessions. They wanted freedom. Then came the moment that changed everything. On November 9, 1989, at a press conference, East German official Gunter Schabowski mistakenly announced that new travel regulations would allow East Berliners to cross freely into West Berlin immediately. His vague and confused statement led to mass confusion. Within hours, thousands of East Germans flooded the checkpoints, demanding to be let through. Overwhelmed and lacking clear orders, border guards opened the gates. What followed was one of the most iconic moments in modern history. Crowds surged through the wall, people climbed on top of it, hammering away at the concrete, and Berliners from both sides embraced in celebration. But here's the truth: the fall of the Berlin Wall was not a planned event. It was not orchestrated by politicians, nor was it a direct result of a single decision. It was a culmination of decades of oppression, years of economic failure, months of growing protest, and one night of miscommunication that led to an irreversible moment of liberation. In the days that followed, the wall continued to be dismantled, piece by piece. By 1990, Germany was on its way to reunification, and on October 3, 1990, it officially became one nation again. The Cold War was coming to an end, and the world order was shifting. The fall of the Berlin Wall serves as a reminder of the power of the people. It was not a war or an invasion that brought it down, it was ordinary citizens who had had enough. It was the voices of thousands in Leipzig, the defiance of those who fled through Hungary, the pressure from those who demanded reform. It was a movement built not on violence, but on an unrelenting desire for freedom. The Berlin Wall fell because no system of oppression can last forever. No government, no matter how powerful, can permanently silence a people determined to be free. And in that single night, November 9, 1989, the world witnessed what happens when courage meets opportunity, when history itself bends to the will of those who refuse to accept tyranny. The Berlin Wall was built to divide, but in the end, it became a symbol of unity, proof that walls, no matter how strong, cannot stand against the force of human freedom.